Hello, hello. Welcome again. I think some folks might have already seen some Boundary talks. My name is Pacent. I lead product management here at HashiCorp for the Boundary team. With me today is John Lyon from Microsoft.
Hi, everyone. John Lyon. I'm a principal program manager in our identity engineering division.
So we'll be talking today about how you can kind of create a secure remote access workflow with HashiCorp Boundary as well as Azure Active Directory to basically create a just-in-time access model at multiple different levels in your environment for Azure-based resources or any other type of kind of infrastructure provider agnostic resources and workflows. So the reason why this is really top of mind for everyone these days is the need to secure remote access based off of multiple different changes in the world. Obviously, the rise of remote work has been huge. Also, the explosion of assets under management with digital organizations increases with the cloud operating model. So the number of targets that you need to manage, the way in which you automate connections to those new targets fundamentally changes traditional access paradigms. And I know that Armand talked about that a little bit earlier today, but if we think about kind of the standard approach to securing access to your infrastructure, that's very much based on kind of that traditional hard network perimeter, soft interior model. The problem is, as you start to kind of explode the number of networks you need to manage, the number of different cloud providers you need to operate against, it's only a matter of time until somebody has access to that network. And the kind of traditional approaches towards managing that access start to break down. If we think about just the scenario of kind of a developer getting access to application infrastructure, there's multiple different disparate controls that need to be put in place in many organizations following that kind of traditional workflow. There might be a private network, a kind of corporate network or private data center network that you need a VPN access to. Once you're on that network, you have connectivity to any of the targets you need to access, which is obviously doesn't follow the kind of principles of least privilege. Similarly, there may be firewalls that impose kind of network location-based controls that become brittle to manage as you start to explode the number of identities you need to manage. Those identities have changing network locations as well as the targets you need to manage. And then ultimately, the actual authorizations and the credentials you need to manage to access those end systems oftentimes don't follow an automated workflow and become brittle to manage. So ultimately, this becomes a really difficult problem space to enable a zero-trust workflow in which every single type of transaction is based off of the identity of the client, either user or machine in question, and all of that access is authenticated and authorized at multiple different levels. So to talk about how Microsoft kind of thinks about the principles of zero trust, I'll pass to John to talk through that.
Thank you. So from a Microsoft perspective, when you're building your zero trust frameworks within your organizations, we have three key principles to keep in mind. The first one is verify explicitly, whether that's a user, both as an individual or maybe it's a workload identity, the location of that user, the device or machine they're accessing it from, and then what are they trying to access? Service, application, data. And start understanding those sort of models and always verify they are who they say they are, the device is healthy, they're not on an Android tablet with a rootkit installed or anything like that, but ensure that you know everything there is about each of those categories. The next one is use least privilege. We still see huge amounts of developers and IT pros out there with domain admin, global admin rights all the time because it allows them to achieve everything with a single silver bullet. Of course, the problem is if that identity gets compromised, it's free reign for the attacker. So just in time and just enough administration is key to securing your environment. Yes, people need the right privileges, but they don't need them all the time. And then assume you've been breached. Always have that mentality that we have been breached. So when you're designing your infrastructure and your services, segment them, use end-to-end encryption. Always try and narrow that footprint to stop lateral movement happening. And for us, identity is the starting point. Whether that's a user or a workload identity, like a service principal, that's where we start with our zero trust model. That individual starting or initiating some authentication. And one of the key messages we'd like to get across is Azure Active Directory is an identity and security platform from Microsoft. Not for Microsoft, it's not just for Microsoft products, it's for the multi-cloud environments that we see today. We have huge numbers of customers and users using Azure Active Directory with Google, with Amazon Web Services. In fact, we've got over 1 million third-party applications and services like HashiCorp and Boundary that are using Azure Active Directory as identity platforms. So we still see lots of people that just assume it's something you have if you have Office 365. That's not the case. It can be a true multi-cloud environment. But multi-cloud brings some new challenges, and in fact, it amplifies some old ones. So the potential of people having domain admin, global admin, having those high-level privileges always associated with them gets amplified because they have global admin for Azure, they may have global admin for AWS, so suddenly there's an identity that can breach multiple clouds. And you've also got the potential of having multiple identities because of the different cloud platforms. So going a multi-cloud journey does amplify some of these problems. And really, why we're excited to be working with HashiCorp on the HashiCorp Cloud Platform and Boundary specifically is together this really starts handling that multi-cloud environment and starts putting control, because Boundary becomes that single entry point to access those resources across your multi-clouds.
Yeah. So to talk a little bit about how this kind of workflow can be created between Boundary and Azure, specifically Azure AD, but then also at the actual target onboarding Azure just as a platform, we'll kind of just review the actual workflow for Boundary. So the idea here is that we kind of create a standardized workflow for developers, DevOps engineers, and technical users to access their end systems. The idea being that just in the same way that HashiCorp has kind of brought provider-agnostic workflows for each step of the app delivery process, whether it's Terraform for provisioning infrastructure, Vault for secrets management, Boundary creates this kind of common workflow for accessing infrastructure endpoints. So that starts at the identity level, right, where every kind of security control that gets put in place is based off of a logical identity that Boundary maintains. With that, you can delegate the actual authentication in the same way that kind of Vault does identity entities and aliases. Boundary does users and ultimate accounts for your auth methods. One of the major ways that you can delegate that authentication is through the OpenID Connect protocol with Azure Active Directory or other OIDC service. Once authenticated, it's not just authentication claims that can be synced to Boundary, but it's also authorizations. So there's quite a bit of work that Boundary has done around syncing entitlement claims maintained at the identity provider level into Boundary. The ultimate result of that is that you can dynamically assign role memberships and permissions within Boundary from entitlements that are dynamic at that identity provider level. Once you've authenticated and authorized that user, there's yet another kind of key integration point in the story, which is how do you enable, I guess, just-in-time network access through Boundary to the end target that you're provisioning. One of the value adds of Boundary is that it provides secure remote access without the need to actually grant direct network access between clients and the target you're trying to connect to. That access is brokered through Boundary's worker nodes. So the question becomes, okay, how does Boundary figure out what those targets are and where they reside? Boundary doesn't need to install any kind of agent on that end infrastructure. Instead, you can configure the discovery of those new services in two different ways. One is with Terraform to kind of configure the service discovery and kind of end addresses that developers need to connect over to so that the end users don't need to think about that network connection info. The other one is through the use of Boundary dynamic host catalogs. So that's ultimately a delegated way to have Boundary act as a client of external providers' APIs and do queries to automate the onboarding of new services. So in the case of Azure, not necessarily Active Directory, but Azure as a whole, I can dynamically sync hosts from my Azure subscription based off of administrator-defined filters for discovering those services. And Boundary plans to kind of have a ecosystem of catalog providers for this agentless discovery. We call these dynamic host catalogs, in the same way that Terraform has providers for provisioning infrastructure against different providers. Boundary will have the kind of same ecosystem for discovering these services. So now that I've handled this problem for developers of authenticating to a single service, authorizing their actions, and ultimately resolving what address Boundary will proxy the session over to, the question becomes, how can I make sure that that access is granted in a just-in-time, least privileged basis? So that happens at a couple different levels. One is the actual network connection proxied through is granted on a time-limited basis. And then the other one being that Boundary can check out credentials from HashiCorp Vault that are single-use in nature. That way I have kind of a just-in-time, least privileged access model created at multiple different levels. At the RBAC level, by syncing claims dynamically from Azure Active Directory. At the credential level, by using a single-use credential. And then actually at the network level, by having a time-bounded authorized proxy to that end system. So ultimately, this workflow, one of the things that we were really excited to announce earlier today in Armand's keynote and that we had a prior session on, is just the idea that this workflow is now available not just in something that you can deploy and manage on your own infrastructure, but also through our HashiCorp Cloud Platform as a managed offering. So the key idea with this is that you ultimately have a single, easy way to get up and running with your environment. It's a single-click deployment, and that creates the same Boundary workflow as you would have for OSS. So just in the same way that you might configure that with your existing Terraform templates for configuring Boundary, you can do so with a brand new Boundary, or HCP Boundary environment, rather. And the idea being that once created, that's a managed SaaS way to do this kind of automated onboarding of identities and services from your identity provider or cloud provider of choice. Again, we'll kind of be walking through a workflow for Azure Active Directory and Azure resources. And then ultimately, this kind of provides a standardized flow for developers to access their infrastructure regardless of where it resides, regardless of the provider of the actual infrastructure, and regardless of the provider of the identity in question. So to talk through actually getting this up and running with Azure Active Directory on HCP Boundary, I'll pass to John.
Thank you. So we're going to whistle through a number of demos today. First of all, we're going to set up single sign-on with the HCP portal, and then we're going to set up single sign-on with Boundary. We'll implement MFA, and we'll use conditional access to secure both of those applications. Because one of the key points here is if Boundary is becoming that single entry point to access all your services, it's pivotal that you ensure that access to Boundary is as secure as it can be. And then we'll also use some behavioral analytics and risk-based information to show how you can actually secure the apps in real time based on risks with your users. So the first demo we'll do will be single sign-on. And there's a couple of reasons we want to do that. One is you're reducing the number of identities you have. You're just using the same credentials you use to log into your workstation to get access to Boundary. But more importantly, it then allows you to leverage Azure AD functionality like multi-factor authentication, passwordless auth, whether that's Windows Hello for Business, a FIDO2 security key, or even the Authenticator app, and Azure Active Directory identity protection, where our intelligent security graph will give you information, risk-based information about that user and that sign-in. And we all know that implementing MFA is crucial because it's the biggest single thing you can do to have an impact and reduce the risk of identities being compromised. So let's crack on with the first demo. So we've got the HashiCorp Cloud Portal on the left, and we've got Microsoft Entra, which is our new name for our identity products. So Azure Active Directory, our permissions management, and verifiable credentials. So we've got the two portals open. We'll start off in the HashiCorp portal, and we'll go into settings, and we'll enable SSO. Quickly, all you've got to do is verify you own the domain. So simple DNS record, and then verify your domain. And then what you'll get given is a number of SAML URLs. So within Azure Active Directory, we'll go into Enterprise Apps. We'll create a new application, and we'll create our own application. Now, very shortly, there will be a HCP beta in the gallery, so you won't have to do all of these steps I'm showing you today. But if you're keen to get on with HCP and Boundary as soon as you get home tomorrow, these are the steps you'll need to go through. So once that app's created, which should only take a second, there we go, we jump to step 2, which is set up single sign-on. And here we'll have a number of options, and the HCP portal at the moment supports SAML. When it comes GA, it will also support OIDC, so you've got that option as well. And then what we simply do is we take the entity ID from the HCP portal and put it in there, and then we'll also do the reply URL and the single sign-on URL. So we'll copy those across. The email attribute you can ignore because we already include email attribute by default, so you don't need to worry about that step. Once we've saved that, we'll get a message about, do you want to test it? We'll ignore that for now and say no. But what we do need is we need some information from the bottom of the Azure portal. So we need the SAML IDP single sign-on, which we give you as login URL. And then we'll also need to download the base 64 certificate. Excuse me. And what we'll do is we'll then copy and paste that into the HCP portal. So just take a second. There we are. There we go. So we just copy that across and paste it in. And it's simple as that. We now have single sign-on set up with Azure Active Directory. Now, we can do a quick test now. What we can do is we can go through and test that user. So what we'll do here is we'll open a new in-private browser window, and we'll sign in with any one of our Azure Active Directory accounts. And what we'll see, standard portal, we'll click sign in. As soon as we enter an email address with the domain that we specified, it'll redirect to Azure Active Directory, and here we can authenticate and use our single sign-on. And we should be in. There we go. Simple as that. But obviously, we want to secure that. We don't just want it set up like that. So the first thing we need to do is limit which users and groups can access the portal. Not everybody in the organization needs access. So how we do that is within our app registration, we can go to properties and we can turn on assignment required. Once we've turned that on, we can go to users and groups, and we can then define which users we want to access. But if we haven't done that, what we'll see when we sign in is we'll see that we won't be allowed access to it, and we'll get a message saying your administrator says you've not been assigned access to this application. So we'll put in the credentials. And there we get the message saying you haven't got access to this application. So over here, we'll go to users and groups, and this is where we can define any of our users or security groups for that matter and specify who can have access. So we'll just add a few users, and then when they'd sign in, they then would have access. But the other thing we want to do is turn on MFA for this application, because we know how important MFA is. So to do this, we'll go to the security section, and we'll create a conditional access rule. And we'll just create a really simple rule here that basically defines all users. So we'll just give it a name. We can select all users because we've already defined who can access HCP. We'll select the application specifically, and because we've got that enterprise app, we can search for it and discover it. We'll talk about conditions in the next demo, so we'll skip that for now. And we'll go to grant. We're going to give them access, but we're going to require MFA. Turn it on, and that's it. So we've now, for the HCP portal, limited who can access it, and we've actually set up MFA. So no matter when they access it, they will get triggered to do an MFA prompt, which we'll see in a second. And of course, because you're using single sign-on, all the logs and the data that gets stored in Azure Active Directory, all that auditing is now available to you. So you can see which users are using the HCP portal, when it was accessed, and drive down any details there. So this particular user has been set up with SMS, so they'll get a text message. They'll then enter their code, and lo and behold, they'll be in. And there we are. So we've securely got access to the HCP portal. We've limited who can access it, and we're in there. So the next step is to take that one step further. There we go. And to do that, we're going to use conditional access. Now, you saw it very briefly there to set up the MFA, but we'll dive into that in a bit more detail. Conditional access is one of our key Azure Active Directory products for helping with your zero trust model. And what it allows you to do is take signals from the user, the location, the device they're using, even what application. Are they using a browser or are they using a client? And then also bring in our insights from the intelligent security graph. And based on those signals, you can define which conditions you're happy with, and then define whether you're going to allow them in, force them to do MFA like we just saw, or maybe you want to force them to reset a password or not let them in at all. And you can go through and define these. So we're going to do some of these now with Boundary. But the first thing we need to do is set up single sign-on with Boundary. Now, Boundary is OIDC at the moment, so the implementation and the setup is different, which is why we're showing single sign-on again. So within the HCP portal, we're going to go to our Boundary instance, open the admin UI, and we can go to auth methods, and we can click New. And we'll select an OIDC one. Excuse me. So we just need to give this a name. And then what we need to do within Azure Active Directory is create an app registration. But before we'll do that, we need to set up an issuer. So the issuer for Microsoft is sts.windows.net/yourtenantid for your Azure Active Directory. And you'll get that from the Azure Active Directory portal. Under the overview, you'll see your tenant ID. So we just copy that and paste that across there. Then we'll go to app registrations, and we'll create a new OIDC application. So in here, we'll give it a name. We'll select single tenant, because at the moment, we want only access to Boundary from anybody that's within our tenant. And what we need here is the key bits is we need the application ID, often referred to as client ID, and we'll copy that across. And then we'll create a secret. So we can go in here, new secret, give it a name. We can define how long we want that secret to last for. We'll just leave it for 6 months. We'll take that value, and we'll put it in that secret box. We'll then add to R256 as a signing algorithm. And then within the portal, we now need to add what type of platform it is. So we select web platform. And for our redirect and front channel logout URLs, we need our instance of Boundary. So we'll copy those across there. And then we just need to scroll down and put the API URL prefix in the Boundary portal. And once we've hit save, we can ignore these pop-ups. We then have 2 other steps we need to do. First, we need to change it from inactive to being public as an OIDC provider. And then we're also going to make it our primary auth method. So when we log into Boundary, you'll see that Azure Active Directory will be the primary method, but you could also have username and password as a secondary option. So when we open into a new in private browser, just give it a second. You'll see there we are. We've got the Azure AD or we could switch to username and password. Obviously, you could disable that and just have Azure AD if you wanted. And we should be in. Brilliant. So we've now got single sign-on with Boundary as well. So the next step is we want to secure this access. So we're going to do a couple of things here. The first one is we're going to look at securing that application with conditional access. So to start with, we'll do MFA again, because we all know how important MFA is. Well, certainly I've harped on about it enough already. So we'll set up that MFA rule, exactly the same process. All users will select the Boundary application that we created. And then we'll just go to grant. And we will require MFA. And then turn it on. So the next conditional access rule we're going to do is a risk-based one. So we're going to use a condition now. So we'll create a new policy, and we'll call this risk-based. We'll define our users as all users. We'll select the application again in the same fashion. And then this time we're going to go into conditions, and we're going to set user risk and sign-in risk. So for those of you not familiar, user risk is where Microsoft has identified that account as potentially being compromised. So we're going to say high and medium. Sign-in risk is when we see unusual activity at sign-in. Things like unlikely or impossible travel. A sign-in attempt from the US, and then 10 minutes later, a sign-in attempt from Amsterdam. We're going to trigger that as unlikely travel. And instead of granting access, we're going to block access. So we've actually said, if you're deemed by Microsoft to be high or medium risk for either user or sign-in, we're not going to let you into Boundary. So what we can do here is we can then actually force one of our users using an API to be a risky user. So if we go into a new in-private browser session, and we go to sign into that portal, we'll sign in, do the MFA, because that conditional access rule has now been enforced. So this time we'll have to verify our identity. And it doesn't have to be SMS. It could be the authenticator wrap. You could use the device they're on as a second factor if they're using biometrics. It could be any of those things, but for the purposes of the demo, just used SMS. And we're in. We're into Boundary. And that would be the same if you were using the client application as well, the desktop client for Boundary. So let's now look at a risky user. So what we can do is we have an API for pretty much everything, and we're going to leverage that API to set one of the users to be high risk. So there's a simple, I'm just using the Graph Explorer there to fire the command across. We pick a user, and we take the user object ID, put that into that query, and when we run it, we've now told Azure Active Directory that that user is high risk. And in fact, when we go into identity protection, we can verify that this user, Grady, has now been tagged as a high-risk user. So if we open a new in-private session, and we try to sign in as Grady, what we'll see is our attempt will be blocked, because conditional access will go, no, this auth method, you're deemed high risk, I'm not going to let you in. They could still access their email, because we've set a rule specifically for Boundary in this instance, and they get the message, you're blocked from accessing this resource. So even simple rules like that can have a big impact, because you're getting that information from Microsoft about, we've seen stolen credentials that match a user, or there's unlikely scenarios with their sign-in attempts or unusual behavior, and because of that, we'll tag it and you've stopped them getting into Boundary and therefore getting access to your other resources. So the last demo I want to show is Privileged Identity Manager. Again, part of Azure Active Directory. We often refer to it as PIM. And what we're going to do here in this demo is set up just-in-time access and just enough administration. So we're going to limit what they can access and when they can access it. So to do that, we'll go into the Identity Governance section. It says, oh, it started. There we go. And within Privileged Identity Manager, we will select a group. Now, I've already created, this is a Windows security group. And within here, you can define those security groups to have active members, people that are always members of that security group, or eligible members. And you can see we've specified a few users that are eligible to be in this group, but they're not always in that group as an active member. So the next thing to do, similar to what we did with the HCP portal, is we're going to go to our enterprise apps, we're going to select Boundary, and what we're going to do is assign that Boundary security group as a group assigned to that application. And then we'll go into the properties and we'll turn on that you have to have assigned permissions to an application. So now when we open an in-private browser and we sign in as that user, MFA and all that will take place. But what we'll find is we'll get that message we saw earlier that says you can't access Boundary because you haven't been assigned rights to use this application. So we'll just do the MFA. And there we are. You've not been assigned in there. But I know that. I'm an IT admin. I know I don't have access. So I would open the Microsoft Entra portal. I would go to Privileged Identity Management, and I would request access to that group. Now, I've signed in with the same user I've just tried accessing Boundary. This is just a normal user. This isn't a domain admin or anything like that. I can see which groups I have the ability to request access to. So I can go in there. I can now go through and activate my membership of that group. Now, I can define a policy, and I can change that to a certain extent. So I just need 1 hour to access it. And because of the audit logs, I need to give a reason why I need access to this group. So I'm going to update some servers, do some patching. Once I hit activate, that will then enable me. Now, we have 2 methods here. The method we're going to show you is self-activation, where I've been assigned based on policy that I can request access to this group, and I will automatically get it. We can have a full workflow where a resource owner or a manager will be notified, and they have to approve my membership to the group. So on some scenarios, you may want to go to that. But because I use Boundary all the time, and my boss knows I need access to it, I've got automatic approval. What it does mean, though, is when I'm not using Boundary, I'm not walking around with elevated privileges that A, I'm not using, and B, I don't need. So now when I go back to the Boundary portal, we'll see that do the MFA prompt because of the rule, but then I'll get straight in because I'm now in that group, and I've got 1 hour of being in that group. I can sign in as many times as I want, patch those servers, but after an hour, I'll go back to being eligible, and if I tried signing into Boundary, I'd be told you've not been assigned rights to use this application. So really, to-do list is when you get back home, get the HCP portal and the Boundary beta, get that single sign-on turned on, enable MFA, because we all know how important that is, and then start creating conditional access rules, not just for Boundary, but for any applications and services you use that are sensitive or need securing. Thank you.
And since we have a couple minutes left, I just want to go over one or two other things around the Boundary workflow that I think are worth stating, although probably obvious. One is that through both Boundary and Azure's REST APIs, that full entire workflow that you saw is scriptable, either through REST or through Terraform configuration to kind of do that configuration at scale. The other bit that is pretty exciting, we didn't get a chance to talk about in the session earlier, is this idea that by GA, one thing that will be upcoming within HCP Boundary is integrated SSO from the platform. So right now, when you deploy an HCP Boundary instance, you have to configure service-level authentication methods. In the future, we'll be adding in platform-level SSO, so that integration with Azure Active Directory can be done at the platform level or at the service level, rather than both like we saw today. So that'll be further streamlining this. And then lastly, we saw quite a bit of work around these conditional access controls at the point of authentication to Boundary, either blocking authentication or approving authentication based off of this risk scoring, based off of these entitlements that users created. The other kind of key part of the workflow within the Boundary side is that you can take this even a step further and sync in authorizations that give you different levels of access controls within Boundary itself. So as a user, potentially, I can still log into Boundary, but maybe I can access service foo, but I can't connect to service bar based off of those conditional policies from the Azure Active Directory level. So again, want to thank everybody today for taking the time to learn about Boundary in this session and the ones earlier. It's now available for free on public beta, not salesy or anything like that. But we've got quite a bit of educational materials to get started, and we'd love to take any questions. I think it's going to be at the booth after this. But really appreciate your time. Thank you, folks.